Hello, and welcome to the Book Lounge, your favorite corner of the internet, where great minds meet powerful ideas. Today, we're unlocking the secrets behind a question that has shaped empires and broken nations. Why do some countries thrive while others remain trapped in poverty? In this episode, we're bringing you Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson, a bold and brilliant investigation into what really determines the fate of nations. Whether you're a policymaker, entrepreneur, student, or just someone trying to make sense of the chaos around the world, this audiobook will change the way you see power, politics, and economics forever. Acemoglu, a renowned economist from MIT, and Robinson, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, spent over 15 years researching institutions, inequality, and economic development across centuries and continents. This book distills their findings into one of the most powerful explanations of global inequality ever written. And let's be honest, it couldn't be more relevant than it is right now. With President Trump once again shaking the global order through sweeping tariff announcements and bold economic moves, and with uncertainty mounting across borders, the insights in this book feel less like history and more like a forecast. Why Nations Fail will give you the framework to understand not just what's happening, but why it's happening, and where we might be headed next. Stick around and you'll discover why extractive institutions collapse societies, how inclusive systems unleash prosperity, and what history can teach us about the storm we're all living through. This isn't just a book. It's a lens through which the modern world suddenly makes sense. So settle in, get comfortable, and welcome to the Book Lounge. Let's begin. Chapter 1. So close and yet so different. Just beyond a fence that slices through the city of Nogales lies one of the most startling economic contrasts in the Western Hemisphere. On the northern side, Nogales, Arizona hums with order, stable jobs, reliable public services, the rule of law. Cross to the southern side, into Nogales, Sonora, and the picture shifts. Lower life expectancy, patchy infrastructure, fragile institutions, and fewer opportunities. This chapter wastes no time. It delivers a clear visual punch, a twin city divided not by nature, but by human design. Same people, same ancestry, same terrain. Yet one thrives and the other struggles. This isn't a story of fate, climate, or cultural flaws. The difference lies in the systems that govern life, systems built over decades, even centuries. On the U.S. side, political institutions protect property rights, enforce contracts, and create incentives for growth. People are encouraged to invest in education, business, innovation. On the Mexican side, decades of authoritarianism and concentrated power have weakened those same protections. Corruption eats away at opportunity. Fear replaces ambition. This chapter sets the tone for the entire book, posing a question that echoes far beyond Nogales. Why do some societies create environments where people can flourish while others do not? And more importantly, how did these systems come to be? Through this vivid example, the authors signal a deeper journey into the roots of prosperity and the machinery of poverty. It's a reminder that nations don't just rise or fall. They are shaped, molded by decisions, power struggles, and institutions that either unlock human potential or keep it caged. The divide in Nogales isn't just a border. It's a mirror, held up to the world, daring us to look closer. Chapter 2. Theories that don't work. This chapter takes a scalpel to the conventional explanations for global inequality and cuts straight through the myths. For centuries, experts, economists, and even politicians have clung to familiar narratives: geography, culture, ignorance. Each one sounds convincing, even intuitive. But when put under the microscope, these theories crumble. Take geography. The belief that tropical climates hinder development because of disease or agricultural limitations doesn't hold when we see wealthy cities like Singapore or Dubai flourishing in sweltering heat. Then there's the cultural argument, the idea that certain societies embrace hard work and innovation while others don't. But history tells a different story. Nations rise and fall, regardless of religion, language, or social customs. South Korea and North Korea share the same cultural roots, yet live in opposite economic realities. Then comes the ignorance theory, that poverty persists because leaders simply don't know what to do. But that excuse wears thin when we examine regimes that actively suppress innovation and hoard power. These are not miscalculations. They are deliberate choices. This chapter urges us to look past surface-level logic. The problem isn't weather, mindset, or lack of knowledge. It's the presence of systems designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. These flawed theories distract from the deeper truth and shield the real culprits of underdevelopment: extractive institutions. By dismantling these popular myths, the chapter clears the fog. It invites us to question everything we thought we understood about prosperity. It asks us to stop accepting simple answers for complex problems. Because when we keep blaming the wrong causes, we give power a place to hide. This is the chapter where old ideas are buried and a new, sharper lens begins to come into focus. Chapter 3: The Making of Prosperity and Poverty. This chapter takes us deeper, not just into economics, but into the DNA of nations. It draws a powerful line between inclusive and extractive institutions, showing how the foundations of prosperity or poverty are laid not through chance, but through choices that echo across generations. At the heart of the argument lies one essential truth. When institutions empower individuals, giving them the freedom to innovate, to own property, to be rewarded for their efforts, societies flourish. When institutions concentrate power, restrict opportunity, and serve the elite, stagnation sets in. The story of the Glorious Revolution in England is a central example. Before 1688, the monarchy held unchecked power. But after the revolution, the balance shifted. Parliament gained authority. Property rights were strengthened. Innovation was no longer a privilege. It became a possibility for many. That shift laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, an explosion of progress that transformed not just England, but eventually much of the world. Contrast that with places like the Kingdom of the Congo or Ottoman Empire, where power remained locked in the hands of the few. Economic incentives were limited. People were taxed, controlled, and excluded. Innovation was stifled before it could even begin. And over time, these systems began to collapse under their own weight. This chapter makes it unmistakably clear. Inclusive institutions don't just create wealth, they create resilience. Societies that invest in their people, protect their rights, and allow creative destruction to flourish are the ones that rise. Those that fear change and cling to centralized power may survive for a while, but they will not thrive. What emerges from this chapter is both a warning and a map. A warning about the dangers of extractive systems, and a map of how prosperity, when built on the right foundations, becomes a force that lifts entire nations. Chapter 4: Small Differences and Critical Junctures, the Weight of History. In this chapter, we see how seemingly small historical events can set nations on divergent paths, locking them into patterns of success or failure for centuries. It's a compelling reminder that history is rarely inevitable. It's shaped by moments, decisions, and choices that alter the course of entire societies. The authors argue that critical junctures, pivotal moments when societies face major decisions, have an outsized influence on the future. These moments, though often appearing minor at the time, can lead to profound long-term consequences. A simple choice, a shift in power, a minor policy change, these can snowball into massive differences over time. The example of the differing fates of North and South America is a powerful one. Both regions were settled by Europeans in similar ways, but small differences in the institutions they established upon arrival had a profound impact. In what is now the United States, settlers established inclusive institutions that gave people a stake in the system. This led to the creation of a vibrant, innovative society. In contrast, in Latin America, the Spanish imposed extractive institutions designed to serve the interests of a small elite. The result? Political and economic structures that continue to stifle growth and opportunity to this day. These critical junctures often occur at moments of significant change, like colonization or revolution. In the case of the Spanish colonies, their institutions were set in place during the early colonial period. The difference between inclusive institutions and extractive ones in these early stages set the stage for centuries of inequality. Even when circumstances seemed similar, such as the arrival of European settlers in both regions, the choices made in those moments created paths that led to starkly different outcomes. This chapter forces us to reconsider the weight of history. It isn't just a series of random events. It's a landscape shaped by decisions that were made at critical junctures. Understanding how these moments reverberate through time allows us to see why some nations succeed while others falter. And it's a reminder: the present is always influenced by the past, and the past is shaped by the choices made in moments of crisis. Chapter 5: I've seen the future and it works. Growth under extractive institutions. In this chapter, we are confronted with the uncomfortable truth that growth and innovation can occur under extractive institutions, institutions that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few. The idea that prosperity only thrives in inclusive democratic systems is upended as the chapter delves into the curious case of growth under inequality and repression. The authors introduce the example of the Soviet Union, a regime whose economic growth was initially impressive despite its extractive nature. In the early 20th century, Soviet leaders implemented policies that spurred industrialization. Yet, despite rapid growth, this progress was always fragile. The regime's extractive nature, rooted in a monopolization of political power and a suppression of individual initiative, created a system that was destined to fail. The catch is that extractive institutions can generate growth, but this growth is often unsustainable. The Soviet Union, for all its early success, was built on a system that repressed creativity and discouraged entrepreneurship. The state controlled production, limited access to opportunities, and centralized power. At the surface, it seemed to work. The economy expanded, industrial output increased. But beneath the surface, the stifling of individual freedoms and the monopolization of power created a brittle system that collapsed under its own weight. The chapter challenges us to reconsider what we mean by growth. Extractive institutions can generate short-term success, but this success is hollow. The long-term effects of such systems are devastating, not only to economic development, but to the very fabric of society. The key takeaway is that true prosperity, lasting, inclusive prosperity, can only thrive where institutions allow for creativity, freedom, and equal opportunity. What we learn here is that growth under extractive systems is often illusory, a mirage that eventually reveals its cracks, leaving societies to face the inevitable collapse when they cannot sustain the weight of inequality and suppression. Chapter 6: Drifting Apart. In this chapter, the authors turn our attention to the widening chasm between nations that started with similar conditions, but over time drifted in vastly different directions. It's a stark reminder that small differences in history can snowball into dramatic inequalities that shape the course of nations for centuries. The authors highlight a powerful example: the divergence between North and South America. In the early stages of European colonization, both regions were exposed to similar European powers, yet the paths they took diverged dramatically. In the North, where British settlers established more inclusive institutions that gave people a stake in society, prosperity slowly began to build. In the South, however, Spanish and Portuguese colonists imposed extractive systems that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few, stifling opportunity and innovation. What's striking here is the notion of drifting apart. It wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event that caused these regions to diverge. Instead, it was a series of subtle but profound institutional choices that set them on distinct trajectories. These choices were made early in their histories, but their effects rippled outward, gaining momentum over time. Take the case of the English colonies in North America. From the start, settlers had more inclusive institutions. They were given the rights to own land, engage in trade, and even participate in governance. This set in motion a cycle of innovation, growth, and prosperity. Compare this to the Spanish colonies, where wealth was extracted from the land and people, and the economy was controlled by a small elite. These extractive institutions led to systemic inequality, which hindered long-term growth and created a foundation of oppression and instability. The chapter illustrates a crucial point. Inequality between nations doesn't happen overnight. It builds over time, layer by layer, as institutions, the invisible forces that govern power, wealth, and opportunity, are either inclusive or extractive. And once nations drift apart in terms of institutional development, it's incredibly difficult to turn back. Chapter 7: The Glorious Revolution. In this chapter, the authors delve into one of the most transformative events in history: the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England. This revolution is often overshadowed by flashier moments in history, yet it played a critical role in shaping the institutions that fostered prosperity and growth, not just in England, but across the world. The Glorious Revolution was, in essence, a moment of profound institutional change. In a land long ruled by monarchs with unchecked power, a bloodless coup marked the transfer of power from King James II to William of Orange. But what was so significant about this seemingly straightforward political event? The answer lies in the aftermath. Unlike other revolutions that left power concentrated in the hands of a few, the Glorious Revolution laid the foundation for a new type of governance, one that would empower individuals and promote inclusive institutions. It resulted in the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty, fundamentally shifting power away from the monarchy and into the hands of elected representatives. This shift was a pivotal moment that set the stage for economic development, creating a framework where people could invest, innovate, and take risks, knowing that their rights and property would be protected. The chapter highlights that the real success of the Glorious Revolution wasn't in the immediate political change, but in the way it set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the creation of inclusive institutions. Once these institutions were in place, they provided the necessary environment for Britain to become the world's first industrialized nation. The example of the Glorious Revolution demonstrates that real change often doesn't come through forceful, dramatic upheavals. Instead, it can be the result of careful strategic shifts in the structure of power. This revolution was not just a fight for political freedom, it was a victory for the future of economic prosperity. It shows how a single historical moment, rooted in institutional transformation, can chart a new course for an entire nation. Chapter 8, Not on Our Watch, Barriers to Development. In this chapter, we uncover the insidious forces that actively prevent nations from breaking out of the cycle of poverty. These are the barriers erected by powerful elites who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The authors show us that the main obstacle to development is not a lack of resources or the inability to innovate, but the political structures that allow a small group of people to maintain control over the economy and society. Take the example of the unequal development in the Americas, particularly the difference between the United States and Latin American countries. The early settlers in North America established institutions that encouraged free markets, private property, and political rights for all citizens. This was not by chance. These institutions were designed to protect individuals and promote competition. In contrast, the Spanish colonies in Latin America were built on extractive institutions that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a few elites. These elites had no interest in expanding opportunity for the masses, as it would undermine their control. This created a system where economic development was slow, uneven, and stifled. The chapter emphasizes that the resistance to inclusive development comes from those who fear losing their privileged positions. When the elites see that inclusive institutions might threaten their control, they fight back, often using force and manipulation. These barriers are not just external, but are deeply embedded in the fabric of society. From political corruption to economic monopolies, the structures that sustain inequality are actively protected. The authors highlight that for real progress to happen, these barriers must be dismantled. This isn't just about reforming laws, it's about transforming the very institutions that govern a nation's political and economic life. Without this shift, nations will remain stuck, trapped in a system that benefits only a few, at the expense of the many. The chapter calls us to recognize that the struggle for development is a battle for the right to share prosperity, a battle that must be fought against those who resist change. Chapter 9, The Turning Point. In this chapter, we witness the powerful forces that can spark change in nations trapped under oppressive regimes. It explores how critical moments, turning points, emerge when long-standing systems of inequality and exploitation face significant challenges. The authors show that while these moments of change can be volatile, they can also create the opportunity for transformative shifts, breaking through centuries of stagnation. A striking example used in this chapter is the case of South Korea and North Korea. Both nations share a similar cultural history and geographical location, but their divergent paths began after the Korean War. Following the war, North Korea embraced extractive institutions with a regime that concentrated power in the hands of a small elite. South Korea, however, took a different route. Despite its early struggles, South Korea's leaders implemented inclusive institutions that allowed for broader participation in the economy and politics. Over time, this shift fostered education, innovation, and a growing middle class, which eventually turned South Korea into one of the world's most dynamic economies. The authors point out that the turning point is often less about an immediate revolution and more about the ability of a society to redefine its institutions. In South Korea, it was the leadership's commitment to reshaping the country's economic and political structures. Over time, this shift created a foundation for sustained growth and development, transforming South Korea into a global powerhouse. The chapter underscores an essential truth. When nations reach a turning point, they are faced with a choice: to continue with extractive institutions that stifle progress, or to embrace inclusive institutions that enable innovation and prosperity for all. South Korea's success story is proof that when given the opportunity to break free from the chains of oppressive systems, nations can soar. But the challenge lies in seizing that moment and creating lasting change. Chapter 10: The Diffusion of Prosperity. In this chapter, we explore how prosperity doesn't just happen in isolated pockets. It spreads, it multiplies, and it reshapes entire regions. The authors show us that the key to understanding why some nations achieve long-term growth while others stagnate lies in the diffusion of inclusive institutions. These institutions don't just exist in one place. They extend and influence surrounding regions, creating an ecosystem of opportunity. One of the most compelling examples the authors use is the case of the Ottoman Empire and its neighbors. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire controlled vast swaths of land, yet its extractive institutions, which concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a few, stifled economic growth. As the empire weakened, however, regions outside its core began to adopt more inclusive systems, allowing for greater trade, innovation, and participation in political processes. The diffusion of prosperity didn't start at the empire's center, but spread outward as more nations embraced the principles of inclusive governance. This diffusion is not a simple linear process. It's more like a ripple effect, where one change leads to another, gradually spreading ideas, institutions, and opportunities. The chapter explains that once inclusive institutions take hold in one region, they can create a domino effect. A flourishing economy in one country, for example, can prompt neighboring countries to reform their own institutions, realizing that they too could benefit from a more open, competitive system. The benefits of these reforms multiply, often crossing borders and lifting entire regions out of poverty. The authors make a critical observation. Prosperity, when shared through the diffusion of inclusive institutions, has the potential to transform not just one nation, but an entire region. It's the willingness of nations to adopt these inclusive institutions that paves the way for broader, interconnected prosperity. In the end, prosperity isn't a zero-sum game. It's something that can grow exponentially when the right systems are in place. The chapter urges us to see the broader picture, recognizing that change in one place can ignite change in many others, creating a wave of growth that can sweep across the globe. Chapter 11: The Virtuous Circle. A nation's destiny doesn't rest on luck or geography. It hinges on the power of institutions and the chain reactions they unleash. In Chapter 11, we step into the momentum of what the authors call the virtuous circle, a reinforcing loop where inclusive institutions, once established, begin to protect themselves, adapt, and evolve, all while resisting threats that aim to drag them backward. History shows that inclusive political systems create the conditions for shared prosperity, and over time, this prosperity supports stronger, more resilient democratic norms. The result? A cycle of participation, accountability, innovation, and growth that becomes increasingly hard to break. England is the key illustration here. After the Glorious Revolution, the country didn't just suddenly become prosperous. What followed was more important: a slow but steady institutional transformation where Parliament gained more power, elites were held in check, and opportunities widened across social classes. Unlike fragile systems that can be hijacked by a single strongman or dynasty, inclusive systems grow stronger under pressure. And it's this resilience that fuels the virtuous circle. New leaders emerge from broader segments of society. Fresh ideas are welcomed instead of stifled, and dissent leads to reform rather than repression. The authors highlight the case of the United States as another example. Despite episodes of inequality, corruption, and even civil war, the institutional foundation laid in the 18th century has proven flexible enough to recover and renew itself time and again. That's the essence of a virtuous circle. Even when knocked down, the system leans toward course correction, not collapse. This chapter is a study in optimism, but a grounded one. Progress, when protected and reinforced by inclusive institutions, has a momentum of its own, and once that flywheel turns, it can carry a nation forward for generations. Chapter 12, The Vicious Circle. In this chapter, we descend into the darker mirror of history, the vicious circle. Where inclusive institutions give rise to self-sustaining progress, extractive institutions do the opposite. They breed more oppression, more inequality, and more fragility with each passing generation. It's a bleak cycle, one that concentrates power in the hands of the few and uses that power to rewrite the rules in their favor again and again. At the center of this spiral lies the logic of fear. Elites fear losing their grip, so they suffocate opposition, silence reformers, and block change even if it would benefit the nation. As institutions become more extractive, they also become more violent, more paranoid, and more resistant to innovation. And as a result, entire societies stagnate. The chapter paints a chilling portrait of the Congo under Mobutu Sese Seko. After seizing power, Mobutu didn't just control the state, he dismantled any institution that might challenge him. He corrupted courts, neutered the press, and turned the economy into a personal treasure chest. His rule was brutal but predictable. He rewarded loyalty and punished dissent, ensuring that everyone below him had a stake in the system's survival, even as the nation rotted from within. But the vicious circle doesn't end when one dictator falls. In many cases, a new regime simply inherits the same predatory framework and keeps the game going. Revolutions often promise change, yet without institutional reform, they end up replicating the same extractive logic. The faces change, the structure remains. This chapter forces us to confront a hard truth. Escaping the grip of the vicious circle is rare and incredibly difficult. It takes a break in the chain, a shock strong enough to crack the system, and a movement determined enough to build something different in its place. Without that, history repeats, and power keeps circling back to where it began. Chapter 13, Why Nations Fail Today. In this chapter, we are brought face to face with the forces that continue to shape the destiny of nations in our modern world. Forces rooted not in lack of resources or geography, but in the architecture of institutions that empower or oppress. The chapter zeroes in on countries that have, on paper, all the ingredients for success: natural wealth, strategic locations, access to global trade. Yet they remain trapped in cycles of poverty, corruption, and stagnation. Why? Because their institutions are extractive. Power is centralized in the hands of the few, who manipulate political and economic systems to benefit themselves, often violently resisting any threat to their dominance. A compelling example explored here is Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. The nation was once known as the breadbasket of Africa, rich in farmland and human potential. But decades of authoritarian rule turned promise into disaster. Through land seizures, suppression of opposition, and destruction of independent institutions, Mugabe's regime crippled the economy and devastated the livelihoods of millions. This wasn't simply mismanagement. It was a deliberate system built to extract power and wealth at the expense of the many. The chapter also sheds light on how global aid and foreign interventions often fail to address the root problems. Pouring money into countries with extractive institutions doesn't create prosperity. It strengthens the elite's grip on power. In these environments, reform doesn't come through development projects alone. It demands political transformation, the empowerment of citizens, and the dismantling of monopolies on power. This isn't just history. It's happening now across continents. From North Korea's iron-fisted dynastic rule to the persistent poverty in parts of Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the pattern repeats. The future hinges on whether nations can break these cycles, shifting toward inclusive institutions that allow creativity, growth, and innovation to flourish. Chapter 13 sounds a clear warning. Prosperity remains elusive where power crushes accountability. And unless the structure of governance is reformed, nations will continue to fall, regardless of how rich their land, how hardworking their people, or how connected they are to the world. Chapter 14, Breaking the Mold. What does it take to rewrite a nation's story? Chapter 14 explores the rare and powerful moments when history's grip loosens, when people, institutions, and movements rise up to shatter the pattern of extractive power and carve a new path toward inclusion and prosperity. We begin in Botswana, a country that defied the odds. At the time of its independence in 1966, Botswana was one of the poorest nations in the world, landlocked and with little infrastructure. Yet, unlike so many other post-colonial African states, it refused the lure of authoritarianism and corruption. Its leaders, particularly Seretse Khama, steered the country away from personal enrichment and toward inclusive institutions. They built a framework grounded in property rights, the rule of law, and transparent governance. When diamonds were discovered, the windfall wasn't captured by elites. It was invested back into education, health, and public goods. This chapter asks us to notice the spark that separates stagnation from transformation. Leadership with vision, civil society with voice, and institutions that serve people rather than prey on them. It also warns us, breaking the mold is neither easy nor permanent. It takes continuous struggle to hold inclusive institutions together. South Africa's transition from apartheid is another powerful example. Though democracy was achieved, the challenges of inequality, concentrated power, and economic exclusion still loom. The foundations of progress must be reinforced, not taken for granted. Throughout this chapter, the message is clear. Nations are not doomed by their past. They are shaped by choices, by windows of opportunity, and by those courageous enough to seize them. Breaking the mold requires defiance, vision, and a relentless push against the forces that profit from keeping things just the way they are. This is the chapter of possibility, a reminder that change, though difficult, is never out of reach. Chapter 15, Understanding Prosperity and Poverty. In this final chapter, the authors bring everything into sharp focus. After a journey across centuries, continents, and countless case studies, we arrive at the heart of the matter. What truly drives the wealth of nations, or their collapse into poverty? And the answer is both simple and profound. At the core, it all comes down to institutions, whether they are inclusive or extractive. Inclusive institutions empower people, spread opportunity, and foster innovation. Extractive ones concentrate power, crush initiative, and guard privilege. This closing chapter revisits these concepts not as abstract theories, but as living forces shaping the destinies of millions, generation after generation. One of the most striking illustrations comes from the Korean Peninsula. With the same language, culture, and history, North and South Korea were once a single nation. Today, their paths couldn't be more different. South Korea flourished because its institutions allowed economic freedom, upward mobility, and gradual democratization. North Korea, under a brutal dictatorship, descended into isolation and despair. Two nations, one people, divided only by the structures they live under. But the final message goes beyond comparisons. The chapter underscores how the cycle of power, once entrenched, rarely breaks easily. Extractive elites resist change. They fear creative destruction and sabotage progress to maintain control. History has shown that revolutions alone do not guarantee inclusive systems. Without checks, revolutions can simply replace one set of extractors with another. Still, there is hope woven throughout this final reflection. Change is possible. History offers examples of countries that broke free from the vicious circle. The virtuous circle, where inclusive institutions beget more inclusivity, can emerge, but only through struggle, collective will, and institutions that allow citizens to hold power accountable. As the last chapter closes, the takeaway is unflinching. Poverty and prosperity are not determined by geography, race, or culture. They stem from how societies are organized, who holds power, and how it is used. This final insight offers both a warning and a roadmap. The future of any nation, no matter how rich or poor today, depends on the institutions it builds or fails to reform. And with that, the curtain falls, leaving us not with easy answers, but with clarity, responsibility, and a renewed sense of urgency. And that brings us to the final page of Why Nations Fail. Before the echoes of history fade from your mind, hit like if this journey through power and poverty gripped you. Subscribe to the Book Lounge for more revelations and drop a comment below. Does your nation rise, or is it silently failing? The next chapter awaits you here.